When I shuffled into that courtroom, my own daughter smirked, and her husband just shook his head in sheer disgust. They thought they had me beat. They thought I was just a broken-down, senile old man who was about to lose everything. But then the judge looked down from his bench. All the color drained from his face. His hand trembled so violently that the heavy wooden gavel slipped right through his fingers and clattered onto the desk. He leaned into his microphone, his voice a terrified whisper. "My God. Is it really him?" The entire room turned and stared at me. No one had a clue who I really was. Before I tell you the rest of this incredible story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Harry Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and for the past 2 decades, I have lived a very quiet, solitary life in the beautiful Hudson Valley of New York. I spend my days covered in sawdust building custom furniture in my wood shop, keeping mostly to myself since my beautiful wife passed away. That is exactly what I looked like as I walked through those heavy oak doors of the county courthouse. I wore a faded, worn-out flannel shirt that still smelled of pine needles and wood glue. My boots were scuffed and heavily covered in dried mud from the estate. My hands, calloused and spotted with age, trembled slightly as I clutched a battered old fedora against my chest. I kept my shoulders slumped, my back perfectly hunched, acting every bit the part of a frail, confused old carpenter who had simply lost his way in a complex world. The air in that imposing courtroom was thick-smelling of harsh floor polish and stale legal dread. Every single footstep I took echoed against the high vaulted ceilings, drawing the unwanted attention of everyone present. A few feet away from me, sitting comfortably at the petitioner table, were the 2 people responsible for dragging me into this nightmare. My daughter Melanie and her husband Derek Preston. Melanie looked like she had stepped right out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. She wore a perfectly tailored designer suit, her hair flawlessly blown out, expensive diamonds sparkling at her ears. She leaned over to Derek and hid a cruel, self-satisfied smirk behind her perfectly manicured hand. Derek was wearing a custom $1,000 suit that he certainly could not afford on his own legitimate salary. He crossed his arms, leaning back in his expensive leather chair with an air of absolute unearned arrogance. He glanced over at me, rolling his eyes as if my mere physical presence was a disgusting insult to his busy day. He leaned closer to Melanie and muttered, making sure his sharp voice carried just enough for me to hear it over the low murmurs of the room. "This clueless old fool does not even know which nursing home he is about to be locked in." I heard every single syllable of those words. I felt the sharp, freezing sting of betrayal slice right through my chest, chilling my blood. This was my daughter. The little girl I had raised, the child I had protected from every harm, looking at me as if I were a useless piece of garbage waiting to be thrown out with the weekly trash. They genuinely believed I was mentally gone. They fully believed their own fabricated narrative that my brain was rotting away, that I was just a helpless, pathetic old burden taking up space on a highly valuable piece of real estate. They thought this hearing would be nothing more than a quick 5-minute formality. A simple rubber stamp from a board judge to declare me legally incompetent, strip me of my human rights, grant them full conservatorship, and hand over the keys to my entire life of hard work. I kept my head bowed, staring at the scuffs on my boots. I let my hands shake just a little bit more, leaning heavily against the defense table. Let them think they have won, I told myself silently. Let them enjoy their final fleeting moments of absolute certainty. The heavy side door opened and the bailiff boomed across the room, demanding that all rise. Judge Leonard Brooks walked up to the high wooden bench. He was a stern, serious man in his late 50s, known throughout the legal community for his strict adherence to procedure and a completely no-nonsense attitude. He sat down heavily, adjusting his reading glasses as he casually opened the thick case file. He did not look up immediately. He was just going through the daily motions of another tragic family dispute, another sad case of inevitable elder decline. Melanie sat up perfectly straight, putting on her absolute best mask of a concerned, heartbroken daughter forced to make a tough choice. Derek puffed out his chest completely, ready to play the role of the responsible, caring son-in-law stepping up to save the day for his ailing father-in-law. Judge Brooks cleared his throat, flipped a page, and finally looked up from the paperwork. His gaze swept casually across the room, passing over the bored prosecutor, passing over Derek, and his confident posture, passing over Melanie and her fake tears, and finally landing directly on me, standing quietly alone at the defendant table. I slowly lifted my head. I stopped trembling completely. I squared my shoulders, shifting my posture in an instant, from a broken, defeated old man into the powerful man I truly was. I looked him dead in the eye, offering no smile, only the heavy, unyielding stare of absolute authority. It took exactly 2 seconds for the realization to hit him. I watched closely as the blood completely vanished from Judge Brooks' face. His stern, professional expression dissolved into absolute, unadulterated shock. He gripped the wooden gavel in his right hand, but his fingers suddenly went completely slack. The gavel slipped from his paralyzed grip, dropping heavily and slamming loudly onto the hard wooden desk. The sharp, violent crack echoed like a gunshot through the completely silent courtroom. He grabbed the edge of his elevated bench, leaning forward as if he needed physical support just to keep from collapsing out of his tall leather chair. He leaned close to his microphone, his voice completely stripping away any judicial decorum, reduced to a terrified, trembling whisper. "My God, is it really him?" The entire courtroom fell dead silent. You could have heard a single pin drop on the carpeted floor. The bailiff stepped forward, looking highly alarmed. Melanie's smug, self-satisfied smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, highly uncomfortable frown. She looked frantically from the pale judge to my steady gaze, completely bewildered. Derek uncrossed his arms, leaning forward, his arrogant posture instantly crumbling into pure, unmasked confusion. He looked around the room, trying desperately to figure out what was happening, why the commanding judge looked like he had just seen a terrifying ghost. They had no idea. They had spent 4 grueling months plotting, scheming, and setting elaborate traps for a senile, uneducated carpenter. They thought they had successfully cornered a weak, defenseless old man who would just silently hand over his life's work. They did not know that they had just dragged a former state Supreme Court Chief Justice into a legal battle. They did not know that 30 years ago I was the powerful man sitting in that very elevated seat, and Leonard Brooks was just a struggling, desperate rookie attorney whose struggling career I had personally salvaged from ruin. I was the absolute law in this state long before they even knew how to read or write a basic legal contract. As the shocked judge continued to stare at me in sheer awe, my mind briefly drifted away from the polished oak walls and the silent, staring faces. The cold, calculating look in my daughter's eyes faded out, replaced by the vivid memory of how this entire waking nightmare actually began. It did not start with legal briefs, medical evaluations, or dramatic courtroom confrontations. It started exactly 4 months ago in the dead of night, with a subtle, terrifying lie. It started the night the gaslighting began. The night I first smelled the lethal gas in my dark kitchen. It was exactly 4 months ago when the first true crack appeared in the foundation of my quiet life. I had been living in my Hudson Valley farmhouse, a sprawling piece of property I bought decades ago when I stepped down from the bench. It was my sanctuary. After my beautiful wife passed away, I filled the silence with the hum of saws and the scent of fresh pine, choosing the simple life of a carpenter over the chaotic world of law. My daughter Melanie and her husband Derek had recently moved into the guest wing, claiming they wanted to keep an eye on me in my old age. I thought it was a gesture of love. I was a foolish, sentimental old man. It was a Tuesday night, shortly past 2 in the morning. The house was usually swallowed in absolute silence, save for the occasional creak of the old timber settling into the dirt. But that night, something pulled me from a very deep sleep. It was not a loud noise. It was a smell. A harsh, unmistakable chemical odor seeping under my bedroom door. Gas. My eyes snapped open. I sat up, my joints aching, and swung my legs out of bed. Then I heard it. a low, steady, vicious hiss coming from the hallway, accompanied by an unnatural, flickering orange glow dancing against the hardwood floors. My heart hammered against my ribs. I moved quickly for a man my age, grabbing my robe and hurrying down the dark corridor toward the kitchen. When I turned the corner, the heat hit me instantly. All 4 burners on my vintage gas stove were turned up to their maximum limit, roaring with thick blue and orange flames. The heavy cast-iron grates were glowing a dangerous, angry red. The smell of raw gas and scorching metal was completely overpowering. I froze for a fraction of a second, utterly bewildered. I had not been in the kitchen since dinner. I had not touched that stove. Before I could even take a single step toward the appliance, hurried footsteps pounded down the main wooden staircase. Melanie burst into the kitchen wearing her silk robe, her face a mask of absolute breathless terror. She let out a dramatic, piercing gasp, covering her mouth with her hands, before sprinting directly toward the stove. She moved with frantic, chaotic energy, violently twisting the heavy metal dials to cut off the roaring flames. The sudden absence of the fire left the large room in stark, frightening shadows, but the thick smell of gas lingered, suffocating and highly dangerous. She rushed to the kitchen windows, throwing them open, to let the freezing night air rush inside, shivering visibly as she leaned against the sink. She took deep, exaggerated breaths, clutching her chest, as if she had just run a marathon to save my life. I stood in the doorway, my mind struggling to process the deliberate chaos unfolding in front of me. Melanie slowly turned around to face me. There was no sudden anger in her eyes, no shock. Instead, there was only a deep, sorrowful pity that made my stomach churn with an undefined dread. She walked over to me, her shoulders slumped in a perfectly calculated posture of utter defeat. She placed a gentle, trembling hand on my shoulder, looking deep into my eyes as if I were a lost, confused child wandering the streets. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking flawlessly on the syllable. "You left the stove on again. That is the 2nd time this week. You almost burned the entire house down." I stared at her, my mouth completely dry. I felt a cold chill wash over my skin that had nothing to do with the freezing draft coming through the open windows. "Melanie," I said, keeping my voice as steady and firm as possible, "I was not in the kitchen tonight. I went to sleep at 10 o'clock. I did not touch those stove dials." She closed her eyes, slowly squeezing out a single, perfectly timed tear that rolled down her cheek and caught the moonlight. She let out a heavy, exhausted sigh, rubbing her temples, as if the enormous burden of my very existence was physically crushing her skull. "Dad, please, do not do this right now." Derek and I woke up because we smelled the horrible gas all the way upstairs. "We both know you came down here to make your chamomile tea, and you just forgot to turn it off. It is okay to forget things, Dad, but you have to admit it. You cannot keep hiding this from us." Her voice was so soothing, so painfully reasonable, so incredibly gentle. That was the most terrifying part of the entire ordeal. She did not yell or scream or accuse me aggressively. She played the tragic victim of severe caregiver burnout with a flawless, Oscar-worthy performance. She began wiping down the granite counters with a damp rag, muttering softly to herself about how stressed she was. She complained to the empty room about how she barely slept anymore because she was constantly terrified I would wander around and accidentally hurt myself in the dark. For one single terrifying split second, looking at her weeping face and listening to her convincing narrative, I actually questioned my own sanity. Did I come down here? Is my mind finally slipping away into the dark abyss of old age? But the sharp instinct of a man who had spent 30 years dissecting complex lies on the witness stand kicked in with brutal clarity. I do not drink chamomile tea. I have never liked the taste of it in my entire life. Furthermore, my nightly routine is incredibly rigid and has not changed in 20 years. I lock the heavy front doors, I check the hallway thermostat, and I read a history book in bed until I fall asleep. I had absolutely not touched those dangerous dials. Yet here was my own flesh and blood looking at me with pure, undiluted pity, actively trying to convince me that my brain was rotting inside my skull. She cleaned the dark kitchen, with the weary, exaggerated movements of a long, suffering martyr, leaving me standing completely alone in the freezing draft. It was a brilliantly executed psychological maneuver. She had planted a toxic seed of doubt right in the middle of my own sanctuary. I slowly walked back to my bedroom, the heavy scent of unburned gas still clinging to my clothes. I listened to the wind howling through the massive oak trees surrounding my property, trying to reconcile the image of the sweet little girl I had raised with the calculating woman standing in my kitchen. I had paid for her college, bought her first car, and funded the wedding that brought Derek into our lives. I had stepped down from the Supreme Court, sacrificing my prestigious career just to ensure she had a stable, loving home after her mother passed away. I gave her everything. And now, as the cold morning light began to bleed through my bedroom curtains, I understood that my immense generosity had bred a monstrous sense of entitlement. I did not sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. When the morning sun finally crested over the hills of the Hudson Valley, I heard the crunch of gravel outside my window. I sat up and peered through the blinds. A sleek, black luxury sedan was parked directly next to Derek's vehicle. A man stepped out. He did not look like a typical small-town physician. He wore a sharp, tailored navy suit and possessed the confident stride of a corporate salesman. Derek rushed out to greet him, shaking his hand vigorously. I quickly got back into bed, pulling the quilt up, waiting for the performance to begin. Less than 5 minutes later, a soft knock echoed on my bedroom door. Melanie pushed it open slowly, carrying a silver tray with a cup of black coffee and dry toast. Her face was expertly painted with an expression of deep, exhausting concern. Derek followed closely behind her, leading the slick stranger right into my sanctuary. The man smiled. It was a bright, completely hollow smile that absolutely did not reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Harrison Gable, a private concierge specialist. Derek claimed he had flown up from Manhattan to ensure I was safe. He spoke to me with a painfully slow, high-pitched, patronizing tone. Dr. Gable set his expensive leather briefcase on the foot of my bed and unclasped it. He did not pull out a stethoscope to listen to my heart. He simply took out a silver pen and a thick yellow notepad. He sat on the edge of my mattress, crossing one perfectly tailored leg over the other, and began asking me a series of utterly insulting, rudimentary questions. "What year is it, Harry? Do you know who the president is? Can you count backward from 100 by sevens?" I answered every single question flawlessly. I gave him dates, names, and precise mathematical calculations without a fraction of hesitation. But every time I answered correctly, Dr. Gable would simply offer a sad sigh and jot down a note on his pad. He looked up at Melanie and shook his head in manufactured sympathy. He turned back to me, adopting a grave expression. He told me that my flawless answers were actually a classic psychological defense mechanism. He claimed that patients suffering from acute neurological decline often memorize mundane facts to mask their rapidly deteriorating cognitive functions. He then deliberately brought up the fabricated incident with the gas stove. He listened to Melanie recount the terrifying midnight fire, nodding sagely, as if confirming a tragic medical suspicion. Without ordering a single brain scan, drawing a single drop of blood, or conducting a genuine neurological exam, this highly paid fraud diagnosed me on the spot. Rapid onset dementia, he declared with absolute terrifying certainty. He told Melanie my brain was shrinking, and I would inevitably become a severe danger to myself. My blood boiled hot beneath my skin. I had spent 3 entire decades sitting on the highest judicial bench in this state. I had dismantled lying expert witnesses, exposed arrogant medical frauds, and sent corrupt professionals to prison for doing exactly what this man was doing right now. I knew exactly what a paid, completely fabricated testimony looked like. Dr. Gable was a hired gun brought in to establish a fraudulent medical baseline for whatever dark legal maneuver Derek and Melanie were planning. I bit my tongue hard. I kept my face blank, projecting the exact image of a confused, terrified old man receiving a brutal death sentence. Dr. Gable reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a small amber prescription bottle. He rattled it gently, the pills clinking together. He handed the bottle directly to Melanie, explicitly bypassing me as if I were already too profoundly incompetent to hold my own medication. He instructed her to give me one pill every single morning and one every night. He called it a mild daily sedative, a gentle supplement designed specifically to calm the damaged nerves in my brain and prevent any further midnight episodes of confusion. Melanie clutched the plastic bottle to her chest, whispering a tearful thank you to the criminal fraud. The very moment Dr. Gable packed his yellow notepad and walked out the bedroom door, Derek wasted absolutely no time. He moved with the swift predatory efficiency of a starving shark smelling fresh blood in the water. He stepped up to my bedside carrying a thick manila folder that he had kept cleverly hidden behind his back. He opened it up and laid a stack of freshly printed documents right across my lap. My highly trained legal eyes instantly recognized the formatting of a comprehensive financial power of attorney. It was an unconditional surrender of my entire estate, my personal bank accounts, my future medical decisions, and my property rights. Derek leaned closely over me. His expensive designer cologne was completely overpowering, aggressively suffocating the clean smell of fresh pine in my room. He offered me a warm, flawlessly executed fake smile. His voice was smooth, dripping with sickening, false affection. "We just want to gracefully carry the heavy burden for you, Harry," he said softly, gently patting my knee. "You have worked so incredibly hard your entire life, but your mind is tired now. The doctor said so himself. You are getting sick, and we cannot bear to watch you bravely struggle with these massive responsibilities anymore. Let us handle the stressful household bills. Let us deal with the complicated taxes and the property maintenance. You just relax in your woodshop, and let us take care of everything else." He confidently pulled a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and held it directly out to me. The dangerous trap was finally set. They fully expected me to simply take the pen sign my entire life away on the dotted line and quietly fade into the background while they ruthlessly liquidated my fortune. But I am not a frail, ignorant carpenter. I am Harry Caldwell. I have stared down murderers and corporate thieves without ever blinking. I looked up at Derek's greedy, expecting eyes. I let my right hand shake violently as I reached out for the silver barrel. I intentionally fumbled, knocking the expensive pen directly onto the hardwood floor. "I am just so incredibly tired today, Derek," I whispered, keeping my voice frail and raspy. "My hand hurts too much to sign anything right now." The doctor's words gave me a headache. "Leave the papers on my desk." Derek's jaw tightened dangerously for a fraction of a second. A quick flash of pure, impatient rage crossed his face, but he rapidly suppressed it behind his polite, caring mask. He picked up the pen, offering a stiff, forced nod of understanding. He told me to rest well, promising they would take wonderful care of me. As they finally left my room, firmly closing the door behind them, I stared at the dangerous legal documents resting quietly on my lap. The plausible lie had been firmly established, but they had made one catastrophic mistake. They left the wolf alive inside. The morning after Dr. Gable delivered his fraudulent death sentence upon my mind, the true nature of their insidious plan began to unfold. I woke up with the sun just as I had done for the past 20 years in the Hudson Valley. I went through my usual morning routine, washing my face, making my bed, and dressing in my worn carpenter jeans. I walked out to the kitchen to grab the keys to my vintage Ford pickup truck. They usually hung on a small brass hook right next to the back door. The hook was completely empty. I stood there for a moment staring at the blank space on the wall, feeling a slow, cold realization creeping up my spine. I turned around and slowly walked into the living room, where Melanie was sitting on the expensive leather sofa, sipping an espresso and scrolling through her phone. I asked her, keeping my voice sufficiently frail and bewildered, where my truck keys had gone. She did not look up from her glowing screen right away. She took another slow sip of her coffee, savoring the bitter taste before finally meeting my eyes. Her face immediately contorted into that same mask of tragic, overwhelming pity she had perfected the night of the stove incident. She set her phone down and walked over to me, taking my rough hands in hers. She spoke in that same high-pitched, patronizing tone people use when scolding a toddler. Dad, Derek and I had a long talk last night after the doctor left. We decided it is simply not safe for you to be behind the wheel anymore. Your reaction times are slowing down, and with your new diagnosis, you are a severe danger to yourself and to the public. We hid the keys for your own good. We cannot live with the guilt if you were to wander off and hurt an innocent family on the highway. I looked at her, letting my jaw hang slightly slack, acting utterly defeated by her flawless, caring logic. Inside, my mind was running through the sheer legal audacity of her actions. Without a court order, without a genuine medical proxy, she was actively confiscating my private property and stripping away my fundamental freedom of movement. I nodded slowly, avoiding her gaze, and shuffled over to the heavy wooden recliner in the corner of the room. I sat down and reached for the old rotary landline phone resting on the side table. I picked up the heavy receiver, intending to dial the local hardware store just to test the boundaries of my new prison. There was no dial tone. The line was completely dead. I traced the thick spiral cord down to the baseboard. It had been physically yanked out of the wall jack. Melanie noticed my confusion and let out another long, dramatic sigh. She crossed the room and gently pried the plastic receiver from my loose grip, placing it back on the cradle with a soft click. Dad, the doctor, warned us that sudden loud noises and stressful conversations could trigger your anxiety episodes, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. You have been getting so agitated lately when the telemarketers call. Derek unplugged the line to keep the house quiet and peaceful for you. If you absolutely need to reach someone, you just let us know, and we will dial the number for you on our cell phones. You do not need to worry your tired mind about anything anymore. We are here to protect you. The invisible iron bars of their loving cage were rapidly slamming shut all around me. They were methodically severing my every connection to the outside world, isolating me entirely under the guise of compassionate medical care. I was a prisoner in the very home my own hard work had paid for. The absolute depth of their calculated deception became glaringly apparent later that same afternoon. I was sitting in my recliner, staring blankly at a muted television screen, playing my role to absolute perfection. A knock sounded at the heavy front door. It was Martha, a sweet elderly widow who lived down the road and frequently brought over homemade baked goods. Melanie rushed to answer the door, and the performance that followed was nothing short of Oscar-worthy. Before Martha could even step over the threshold, Melanie collapsed into her arms, burying her face in the older woman's shoulder, weeping loudly and uncontrollably. Martha, clearly startled, gently patted my daughter's back, asking what terrible tragedy had occurred. Melanie guided Martha into the foyer, standing just far enough away that I could hear them, but maintaining the illusion that they were speaking in private. She poured out a tragic, completely fabricated tale of my rapid, heartbreaking mental decline. She wept about the midnight fires, the terrible confusion, and the heavy burden she and Derek were bravely bearing. She cried about how she was giving up her youth, her freedom, and her own happiness just to ensure her poor failing father was not locked away in a cold, sterile institution. She painted herself as the ultimate self-sacrificing martyr. I watched Martha look over at me with eyes swimming in genuine, profound sorrow. The poor woman believed every single lying word falling from my daughter's lips. Martha squeezed Melanie's hands, praising her incredible strength and boundless filial devotion. She promised to pray for us and quickly excused herself, too overwhelmed by the tragic scene to stay for tea. As the front door clicked shut, the weeping instantly stopped. Melanie wiped her completely dry eyes, dropped her tragic posture, and walked past me toward the kitchen, humming a cheerful, upbeat tune. She did not even glance in my direction, fully convinced I was entirely oblivious to her sudden transformation. I remained absolutely motionless in my worn recliner. I kept my eyes fixed on the muted television screen, my face entirely slack and devoid of any intelligent comprehension. But behind that carefully constructed mask of a broken, senile old man, my mind was functioning with the razor-sharp clarity of a Supreme Court Chief Justice. I observed every single detail of my unjust confinement. I analyzed their ruthless methods, mapping out the precise legal and psychological boundaries of the terrifying prison they were building around me. The plausible lie they had constructed was incredibly thorough, designed to convince doctors, neighbors, and eventually a presiding judge that I was a completely lost cause. But the dark lie was fundamentally cracking under the heavy weight of my silent, unyielding scrutiny. I was not losing my mind. I was gathering critical intelligence. They had successfully locked the doors, severed the phone lines, and isolated me from my community. They thought they had entirely neutralized the threat. They were completely wrong. The real game was only just beginning. The very walls of my beloved farmhouse, the structure I had restored with my own two hands, now felt incredibly foreign and hostile. Every locked door and severed wire was a deliberate, calculated insult to my legacy. I would sit quietly in the shadows and watch them weave their deceit. The destruction of their illusion would be absolute. The very next morning, the wolf began his silent rebellion. When Melanie walked into my bedroom, carrying that small white pill on a porcelain saucer, I did not argue. I offered her a vacant, docile smile, the exact kind of empty expression one might expect from a man whose mind was rapidly slipping into the dark abyss of dementia. She handed me the pill and a glass of cold water, watching me with calculating eyes to ensure I complied with her medical trap. I placed the bitter tablet on my tongue, took a large gulp of water, and swallowed hard, making a loud gulping sound, but the pill never went down my throat. I tucked it deep into the lower pocket of my cheek, holding it firmly against my gum. Melanie smiled, patted my arm with sickening affection, and walked out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. The moment I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway, I rushed to the adjoining bathroom, spat the poison into the sink, and washed it down the drain with scalding hot water. I repeated this performance every morning and every night for the next 4 days. The physical transformation was astonishing. With each passing day that my bloodstream was free of those toxic antipsychotics, the thick fog in my brain began to lift. The sluggishness in my limbs evaporated, replaced by a vigorous energy. My thoughts returned with the razor-sharp precision of a seasoned legal scholar. I could remember details, dates, and complex legal precedents with flawless clarity, but I dared not let them see this recovery. If they realized I was lucid, they would inevitably change their tactics and force an aggressive confrontation. Instead, I leaned completely into the deception. I weaponized their malicious diagnosis against them. I began to shuffle my feet heavily when I walked. I intentionally spilled my coffee on the kitchen counter. I stared blankly at the living room walls for hours on end, ignoring their conversations and pretending to be lost in a world of senile confusion. They fell for the act hook, line, and sinker. Convinced that the heavy sedatives were keeping me trapped in compliant lethargy, their behavior grew increasingly careless. They stopped lowering their voices when they discussed their plans in the kitchen. They stopped pretending to care when they thought I was not looking. And then came the night that laid their true, sinister motives completely bare. It was a Thursday, shortly past 3 in the morning. I was lying in my bed perfectly still, maintaining the slow breathing of a man trapped in a deep, chemically induced slumber. The house was entirely silent, save for the howling of the autumn wind pressing against the window panes. Then I heard it. It was a sound I knew intimately, having lived in this Hudson Valley farmhouse for nearly 3 decades. It was the distinct heavy creak of the third floorboard in the main hallway. Someone was moving quietly through the dark house. I opened my eyes. The room was bathed in the pale silver glow of the moonlight. I carefully slipped out of my warm bed, placing my bare feet on the edges of the floorboards where the wood was solidly reinforced and would not make a sound. I moved with the deliberate caution of a man who knew his territory perfectly. I approached the heavy bedroom door, gripped the brass handle, and turned it with agonizing slowness to prevent the internal mechanism from clicking loudly. I cracked the door open just a fraction of an inch, enough to give me a clear line of sight down the shadowed corridor. At the far end of the hallway, a thin sliver of golden light was spilling out from beneath the door of my private study. My study was my sanctuary, a room filled with confidential legal documents, decades of private case files, and my most valuable personal assets. No one was allowed in that room without my explicit permission. My heart began to hammer a steady rhythm against my ribs as I crept down the hallway, keeping my back pressed firmly against the cool plaster wall. When I reached the study, I carefully peered through the narrow gap between the door and the frame. The sight before me made my blood run ice cold. Derek was standing in the center of my study, bathed in the harsh light of my brass desk lamp. He was not looking for my medical records. He was not searching for insurance policies or health proxies. He had bypassed my filing cabinets and moved directly to the large landscape painting hanging on the far wall. With frantic, greedy movements, Derek pulled the heavy painting aside, revealing the steel face of my hidden wall safe. He held a small piece of paper in his trembling hand, squinting at the numbers written on it. He reached out and began spinning the combination dial. I held my breath, watching him work the lock. He spun it left, then right, then left again. A sickening metallic click echoed in the room as the heavy locking bolt snapped back. He had somehow managed to steal my private combination. Derek yanked the heavy steel door open, his eyes wide with a desperate, feverish hunger. He began frantically pulling out stacks of legal folders, tossing my private birth certificates and banking ledgers carelessly onto the floor. He was digging deep into the back of the metal vault, searching for something specific, something incredibly valuable. Finally, his hands landed on a thick, dark blue portfolio. I instantly recognized it. It was the master file containing the original notarized property deed to my sprawling 100-acre estate. Derek pulled the thick parchment documents out of the folder, laying them flat on my desk under the bright lamp. He leaned over the papers, tracing his finger along the property boundaries and the legal ownership clauses. He pulled out his cell phone, snapping several bright, flashing pictures of the confidential legal deed, capturing every single page, every signature, and every notarized stamp. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face, transforming his features into an expression of pure, unadulterated greed. He was not trying to protect an ailing father-in-law. He was not burdened by the sudden, tragic reality of a dementia diagnosis. This entire elaborate medical farce, the dangerous antipsychotic pills, the gaslighting, the isolation tactics, it was all a highly calculated, malicious strategy to seize control of my real estate. He needed the specific lot numbers, the precise acreage boundaries, and the original title information to draft a fraudulent transfer of ownership. He was preparing to sell the ground right out from under my feet, the absolute second the court handed him the power of conservatorship. I stood in the dark hallway, watching my son-in-law photograph the legal proof of my entire life. The sheer audacity of his crime was breathtaking. They severely underestimated the man they were trying to rob. They thought my mind was rotting, but my intellect was sharper than ever. It was time to utterly destroy both of them. The next morning dawned with a heavy overcast sky that perfectly mirrored the suffocating atmosphere inside my home. Melanie and Derek were in high spirits at the breakfast table, chattering animatedly about a sudden trip into town. Melanie poured my coffee, treating me to that same sickeningly sweet voice she had weaponized over the past few days. She told me they had to run some very important errands on my behalf, claiming they were going to speak with the bank manager to ensure my retirement funds were securely organized under their new protective umbrella. They explicitly instructed me to stay in my favorite recliner and watch television, warning me that the damp autumn air would certainly agitate my fragile condition. They locked the heavy front door from the outside, leaving me trapped inside the very walls I had built. I waited exactly 20 minutes after the crunch of their luxury sedan tires faded down the long gravel driveway. I did not move toward the television. Instead, I went directly to my bedroom closet and pulled out a pair of heavy mud-stained hiking boots. They had confiscated my truck keys and disabled the telephone, essentially grounding me, but they completely forgot that I knew every single inch of the vast surrounding wilderness. I could not simply walk down the main county road. If any of our well-meaning neighbors saw me wandering the pavement alone, they would immediately call Melanie, fully believing her tragic narrative about my wandering dementia. I had to remain entirely unseen. I slipped out through the back patio door, stepping onto the damp soil of the dense Hudson Valley woods. The air was biting and cold, carrying the sharp scent of decaying leaves and wet pine. I began the arduous 3-mile trek toward the center of town, using an old, overgrown hunting trail I had not walked in nearly a decade. The physical exertion was immediately punishing. Branches whipped against my flannel shirt, and the uneven rocky terrain tested the limits of my 70-year-old knees. My breathing grew heavy, my lungs burning with the crisp autumn air. Yet, with every single agonizing step I took through that dense forest, my mind grew sharper. The physical pain was a welcome grounding anchor, pushing the last lingering remnants of the mental fog out of my system. I was no longer an isolated, heavily medicated victim trapped in a recliner. I was a man marching deliberately toward the absolute truth. It took me just over an hour to clear the tree line and reach the rear alleyway behind the town square. I kept my head down, pulling my battered fedora low over my eyes, moving swiftly through the shadows until I reached the back entrance of the local independent pharmacy. I pushed open the heavy glass door, the familiar bell chiming brightly above my head. The store was relatively quiet, smelling faintly of antiseptic and peppermint. Behind the elevated pharmacy counter stood Thomas Mitchell, the head pharmacist. Thomas was a meticulous, highly intelligent man in his late 60s who had served this small community for his entire professional life. He was also one of the very few people in this valley who knew about my former career on the state Supreme Court. I walked directly up to his counter, bypassing the small waiting area. Thomas looked up from his computer monitor, offering a warm, familiar smile that instantly faltered when he truly registered my appearance. I was covered in sweat, my boots were caked in fresh mud, and my chest was heaving. I did not offer a casual greeting. I reached deep into the front pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out a small, crumpled tissue paper. I carefully unfolded it on the pristine glass counter, revealing 4 of the small white unmarked pills Melanie had been feeding me under the guise of compassionate medical care. "Thomas," I said, my voice low and urgent, "I need you to tell me exactly what these are, and I need you to keep this completely off the official medical record." Thomas frowned, his professional curiosity immediately piqued. He picked up one of the small white tablets, holding it under the bright fluorescent light of his workspace. He retrieved a small magnifying loupe from his breast pocket and examined the microscopic imprint stamped on the side of the chalky medication. I stood entirely still, watching his face. I expected him to identify a strong sleeping pill or perhaps a heavy anti-anxiety medication. I was completely unprepared for his actual reaction. The color rapidly drained from Thomas' face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His hand actually trembled as he placed the tiny white pill back onto the crumpled tissue paper. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and profound confusion. He leaned over the counter, drastically lowering his voice so the young cashier at the front of the store could not possibly hear us. "Harry," he whispered, his tone thick with genuine terror, "where in God's name did you get these? Who gave these to you?" "Just tell me what they are, Thomas," I demanded softly, gripping the edge of the counter to steady my shaking hands. Thomas took a deep, shuddering breath. "This is not a mild sedative, Harry. These are highly potent, incredibly dangerous antipsychotics. They carry a severe black box warning from the federal government. They are exclusively prescribed to patients suffering from extreme violent schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. They are essentially chemical restraints used to completely subdue erratic patients in locked psychiatric wards." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my muddy boots. The sterile smell of the pharmacy suddenly made me incredibly nauseous. "What happens if a healthy man takes them?" I asked, my voice barely more than a hollow croak. "What happens if he takes 2 of these every single day?" Thomas stared at me, his professional demeanor crumbling into raw, unfiltered empathy. "If a healthy man with normal cognitive function takes this dosage daily, it will systematically shut down his higher brain functions. It will cause extreme lethargy, profound confusion, terrifying hallucinations, and a total loss of short-term memory. It will literally mimic the most aggressive, rapid-onset symptoms of severe dementia. And Harry, if taken long enough, the chemical damage to the neural pathways becomes completely permanent. It will literally destroy your mind from the inside out." The crushing weight of his clinical explanations slammed into my chest with the force of a speeding freight train. I stared down at those innocent-looking white pills resting on the glass counter. They were not merely a tool to keep me docile. They were a deliberate, malicious weapon. Melanie and Derek were not just planning to steal my property and lock me away in a state facility. They were actively, methodically poisoning my brain. They were intentionally destroying my intellect to ensure that their fraudulent dementia diagnosis became a permanent, irreversible reality. A cold, dark wave of absolute fury washed over me. This was an attempted murder executed with a warm, loving smile. I pocketed the pills. Thomas grabbed my arm to stop me. His grip was surprisingly strong for a man his age. He pleaded with me to go straight to the police, to let him call the authorities right then and there. I looked into his terrified eyes and slowly shook my head. I told him that going to the police now would only trigger a messy domestic dispute, a word-against-word scenario where they held a fabricated medical diagnosis from an expensive Manhattan doctor. I needed irrefutable proof of their endgame before I struck. I thanked Thomas for his loyalty, turned my back, and walked out of the pharmacy on phone. The hike back through the dense Hudson Valley woods felt entirely different than the journey there. The biting cold of the autumn air no longer registered against my skin. My blood was running hot with a terrifying singular focus. The physical exhaustion in my 70-year-old knees vanished, replaced by the pure adrenaline of a man fighting for his own survival. Every snapped branch and crushed leaf beneath my heavy boots echoed with the rhythm of my mounting fury. They were trying to erase my mind. They were trying to reduce a lifetime of hard work, intellect, and dignity into a drooling, compliant shell. I reached the edge of my property just as the afternoon shadows began to stretch long and thin across the wet grass. The gravel driveway was completely empty. Derek and Melanie were still out running their supposed errands, likely securing more legal traps in town. I stayed off the main paths, moving silently behind the tall oak trees until I reached the detached 3-car garage. This was Derek domain now. He had claimed it the moment he moved in, filling it with his expensive golf clubs and pristine imported cars. I bypassed my private study and the main house entirely. The truth I needed was not hidden in my safe or filed away in a polished cabinet. Derek was too arrogant, too careless for that. He viewed me as a senile ghost haunting my own home. I knew exactly where to look. I walked to the back corner of the dimly lit garage where a row of heavy black contractor trash bags was piled high against the concrete wall. Derek had taken over the chore of handling the household waste, loudly complaining about it to anyone who would listen. He insisted on sealing the bags himself and hauling them to the local dump, explicitly forbidding me from helping. At the time, Melanie framed it as a loving gesture to protect my fragile back. Now I understood it was a calculated quarantine of information. I pulled a sharp pocket knife from my denim jeans and sliced open the first thick, black plastic bag. The smell of coffee grounds and rotting food hit me instantly, but I did not hesitate. I plunged my bare hands into the filth, tossing aside empty wine bottles and soiled paper towels. I was a desperate man hunting for the missing pieces of a deadly puzzle. The first 2 bags yielded nothing but domestic waste. I moved to the 3rd bag, slicing it open from top to bottom. Near the center of the foul pile, tightly bound by a thick rubber band, was a compressed stack of torn paper. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled the bundle free, wiping away the damp coffee stains, and carried it over to the small workbench beneath the single dusty window. I carefully snapped the rubber band and spread the torn fragments across the wooden surface. It was like reconstructing a shattered mirror. I smoothed out the heavy cardstock pieces, matching the jagged edges together with meticulous precision. As the text slowly formed before my eyes, the official seal of the State City Planning Commission came into sharp focus. The letters were addressed directly to me, Harry Caldwell. They were dated over the past 6 months, systematically intercepted, opened and destroyed before they ever reached my hands. I leaned over the workbench, the dim light casting long shadows across the damning documents. The legal jargon was dense, but my decades on the bench allowed me to translate the bureaucratic language instantly. The commission was not writing to complain about property taxes or local zoning violations. They were writing to officially notify me of a massive, unprecedented geological survey that had been conducted on my sprawling 100-acre farm. I read the second reconstructed letter. It detailed the discovery of a massive, pure, untouched underground water aquifer situated directly beneath my south pastures. It was one of the largest pristine water sources discovered in the region in a century. But that was only the beginning of the terrifying revelation. I pieced together the third document, a thick proposal packet, from a massive international real estate development conglomerate. The proposal explicitly outlined a highly confidential, fast-tracked plan to completely rezone my quiet agricultural farm. They intended to purchase the land and develop an ultra-exclusive luxury eco-resort, capitalizing on the pristine natural water source to build high-end spas and private estates. The numbers printed at the bottom of the proposal packet made the breath catch violently in my throat. I traced my calloused finger over the ink, ensuring my aging eyes were not deceiving me. The current valuation of my farm, the quiet patch of dirt I had bought for practically nothing decades ago, was officially assessed at $150 million. $150 million. The number echoed in my head, loud and deafening. Suddenly, every single piece of their twisted, malicious puzzle locked flawlessly into place. The sudden, unprompted move into my guest wing, the exaggerated, suffocating displays of daughterly affection, the isolated phone lines, the confiscated truck keys, the midnight fires, the fabricated dementia diagnosis, the highly toxic mind-destroying antipsychotic pills. Melanie and Derek were not just a pair of greedy, entitled children waiting impatiently for a modest inheritance. They were actively sitting on top of an absolute goldmine. They had intercepted the initial survey letters, realized the astronomical fortune buried directly beneath my boots, and formulated a ruthless plan to steal it all. They could not simply ask me to sell. They knew I loved this farm more than life itself, that I intended to die peacefully in my own bed and leave the land to a local land trust to protect the beautiful valley. I was the one single stubborn obstacle standing between them and a staggering, unimaginable fortune. To secure that level of wealth, they needed complete, unquestionable legal control over my entire estate. They needed me declared medically incompetent by a corrupt physician. They needed my brain chemically destroyed so I could never fight back in a court of law. They were willing to murder my mind, strip away my dignity, and lock me in a chemical prison for the rest of my days just to cash a check. A terrifying, unnatural calm washed over me. I gathered the torn documents, folding them carefully into my pocket. The hunted old man was dead. The judge had returned to his courtroom. I left the shadows of the detached garage and slowly made my way back to the farmhouse. The damp evening air clung to my clothes, but the cold was nothing compared to the absolute ice currently pumping through my veins. I slipped through the back patio door, moving with the silent grace of a predator, stalking its unaware prey. I went straight to my bedroom and carefully hid the reconstructed planning commission documents beneath the false bottom of my heavy oak dresser. Those papers were the ultimate proof of their staggering greed, the undeniable motive behind their elaborate medical fraud. Once the evidence was securely hidden, I stood before the large mirror mounted on my closet door and began to prepare my physical performance. I let my shoulders slump forward instantly, stripping away the proud, upright posture I had maintained for 70 years. I relaxed the muscles in my face until my jaw hung slightly open, practicing the vacant, unfocused stare of a man completely lost in a chemical fog. I mussed my gray hair and allowed my hands to adopt a faint, continuous tremor. When I heard the heavy front door open and the sound of their cheerful voices filling the foyer, I shuffled slowly into the living room and collapsed into my worn recliner. The perfect picture of an over-medicated, rapidly declining victim. Melanie and Derek walked into the kitchen carrying expensive bags of gourmet groceries, chatting animatedly about a wine tasting they planned to attend the following month. They completely ignored my presence in the corner of the room, treating me like a piece of broken furniture they had not yet bothered to throw away. The smell of roasting garlic and seared meat soon filled the lower floor of the house as Melanie actively prepared a lavish dinner. It was a lavish meal paid for entirely by the funds they were already actively draining from my personal bank accounts. When the warm food was finally ready, Derek walked over and grabbed my left arm with far more physical force than necessary, hoisting me out of the recliner and hauling me toward the dining room. He shoved me roughly into my designated wooden chair at the end of the long mahogany table, treating me with the rough, impatient disdain a frustrated warden might reserve for a troublesome prisoner. I sat quietly at the table, my chin resting heavily on my chest, staring blankly at the porcelain plate placed directly in front of me. I refused to touch the polished silver fork, letting my arms hang limply at my sides. Derek poured himself a generous glass of expensive imported red wine, swirling the dark liquid, while he loudly discussed the new custom leather seats he wanted to immediately order for his luxury sports car. Melanie nodded along, cutting her tender steak into tiny, precise squares, offering input on various color options, as if they were already celebrating their massive impending financial windfall. I listened closely to their greedy, arrogant banter, carefully mapping out every single detail of my upcoming legal counterattack. They were utterly convinced that the heavy antipsychotic pills were actively destroying my fragile neural pathways, confident that the silent man sitting at the table was nothing more than an empty hollow shell waiting to expire. It was time to give them exactly the tragic performance they desperately wanted to see. I slowly and deliberately raised my right hand, letting my rigid fingers twitch and jerk with violent, uncoordinated spasms. I reached across the polished wooden table toward the heavy, ornate crystal water glass sitting right near my porcelain plate. I made sure to knock my knuckles awkwardly against the hard edge of the plate, drawing their immediate attention to my struggling, pathetic movements. Melanie stopped chewing her food, watching me with a cold, highly critical gaze. Derek paused his wine glass halfway to his mouth, a sudden look of pure, unadulterated amusement dancing wildly in his dark eyes. I wrapped my weak, trembling fingers around the thick crystal, gripping it loosely. I lifted it a few fragile inches off the table, letting my hand shake so violently that the floating ice cubes rattled loudly against the heavy glass. Then, with a deliberate, perfectly calculated release of my tense muscles, I let the heavy glass slip entirely from my unstable grasp. It plummeted straight toward the floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces across the expensive hardwood. A large puddle of freezing water splashed over the polished planks, soaking the cuffs of my denim trousers. I immediately recoiled, pulling my arms tightly against my chest, and let out a soft, frightened whimper, portraying the exact image of a confused, terrified patient, completely overwhelmed by his own failing body. The dining room fell into an absolute, deeply suffocating silence, broken only by the steady sound of the melting ice cubes sliding across the wet floor. I kept my head down firmly, refusing to look at them directly, waiting to see how the loving daughter and the caring son-in-law would react to this tragic display of my supposed rapid dementia. Derek did not leap up from his seat to check if I was severely injured or physically frightened by the sudden violent crash. Instead, he slowly and very deliberately set his expensive wine glass down on the table, leaned back in his comfortable chair, and let out a low, highly amused chuckle. I watched from the corner of my eye as he smirked a cruel, highly satisfied grin spreading across his face and delivered a slow, deliberate wink directly to my daughter. It was a clear signal of absolute victory, a silent confirmation that their toxic medication was working exactly as they had maliciously intended. Melanie did not show a single ounce of compassion or basic human concern. She did not ask if I was cut by the flying shards of crystal. She threw her expensive linen napkin onto her plate with a violent, deeply frustrated motion. She let out a heavy sigh, rolling her eyes in absolute disgust at my pathetic, trembling form. She pushed her chair back abruptly, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. She stood up and looked down at me, her face completely devoid of the sweet, caring mask she wore so flawlessly for our neighbors and the visiting doctors. She kicked a large, jagged shard of broken crystal out of her way, pushing it roughly under the table with the toe of her expensive shoe. She stared at me, her eyes flat and dead, entirely empty of the warmth and love I had known her entire life. She leaned slightly forward, placing her hands on her hips. Her voice was no longer high-pitched and soothing. It was flat cold and utterly devoid of any human empathy. "Just a few more weeks until we dump this annoying old freak in a state facility," she muttered coldly. The words hung in the quiet dining room, a brutal death sentence. My blood ran completely and entirely cold. All paternal love died in that exact second, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a Supreme Court justice preparing for absolute war. The morning following that devastating dinner, I fully embraced my new reality. If they wanted a broken, senile old man, I would give them a performance worthy of the stage. The key to a successful deception is complete and utter commitment to the role. I began by altering my physical appearance. When I emerged from my bedroom, I made sure to wear one heavy leather work boot on my right foot and a soft plaid house slipper on my left. My flannel shirt was buttoned incorrectly, leaving the collar askew. I shuffled into the kitchen, dragging my feet against the hardwood, letting my shoulders slump heavily. Melanie was standing by the sink, pouring a cup of expensive coffee. Derek was sitting at the island, typing rapidly on his laptop. I walked directly past them, my eyes fixed on the blank wall above the refrigerator. Derek did not bother to look up from his glowing screen when he offered a casual morning greeting. I stopped blinking slowly and turned my head with exaggerated stiffness. I looked right through him, my face a perfect canvas of profound confusion. I rasped my voice, making it thin and trembling, and asked David if he had seen my gardening gloves because I needed to prune the roses before the frost set in. Derek stopped typing. He exchanged a quick, highly amused glance with Melanie. He let out a low, arrogant chuckle, correcting my use of his name and reminding me that it was the middle of November and the roses were already dead. I whispered a soft apology, letting my jaw hang slightly open. I turned away, shuffling slowly toward the living room. I sat in my recliner and stared blankly at the dark, silent television screen for 3 solid hours. I did not blink. I did not react when Melanie vacuumed the rug right next to my feet. I became a piece of invisible furniture. Their guard, already lowered by arrogance, completely vanished. They began speaking openly around me, entirely convinced that my brain was nothing more than a ruined sponge. They discussed the massive eco-resort development, casually dropping the names of corporate executives and zoning board members they needed to bribe or manipulate. They talked about the $150 million valuation as if the money was already sitting securely in their bank accounts. I listened to every single word, filing the invaluable intelligence away in my razor-sharp mind. By the early afternoon, they grew entirely bored with my pathetic presence. Derek announced he was driving into the city to meet with a real estate attorney. Melanie decided to accompany him, claiming she needed to shop for a new winter wardrobe. They locked the front door behind them, leaving me alone with my supposed dementia. The moment their car tires hit the gravel driveway, my vacant stare evaporated. My posture straightened. The frail, trembling old man vanished, replaced by the formidable force of a judge who had spent 30 years destroying criminals. I walked purposefully to the back of the house, stepping out into the cold afternoon air. I crossed the damp grass toward my woodshop. This was the one place they never bothered to monitor. To them, the shop was just a dusty shed where a senile carpenter wasted his final days covered in sawdust. To me, it was a tactical fortress. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The familiar, comforting scent of cut pine and motor oil filled my lungs. The shop was dimly lit, shadows clinging to the vintage tools hanging on the pegboards. I walked to the far corner of the room, directly behind a massive cast-iron table saw. The floorboards here were thick and scarred from decades of heavy labor. I knelt down on the dusty floor, running my fingers along the seam of the fourth plank from the wall. I pressed firmly on a hidden knot in the wood, and the heavy plank popped up slightly. I wedged my fingers underneath and pulled the false floorboard aside. Resting in the dark, hollow cavity beneath the floor was a small waterproof plastic lockbox. I pulled it out, brushed away a layer of fine sawdust, and unclasped the heavy latches. Inside sat a cheap, prepaid cellular burner phone. I had purchased it years ago, keeping it strictly for absolute emergencies. I charged it once a month, ensuring it was always ready. I pulled the small black device from the box and pressed the power button. The screen glowed to life, displaying full battery power and a strong cellular signal. I did not need a contact list. My memory was pristine. I dialed a specific New York City area code followed by 7 numbers I had memorized over 2 decades ago. As the phone began to ring, I pictured the woman on the other end of the line. Valerie Shaw. 25 years ago, Valerie was a brilliant, fiercely ambitious, and entirely broke law student. I had hired her as my personal clerk when I was presiding over the state's most complex corporate fraud cases. I saw a raw, unyielding fire in her eyes that reminded me of my own youth. I mentored her, guided her through the brutal political trenches of the legal system, and personally recommended her for her first major position at a top-tier Manhattan firm. Today, Valerie Shaw was universally feared. She was the most ruthless, high-powered corporate litigator in New York City. She destroyed massive conglomerates for breakfast and dismantled arrogant billionaires before lunch. She owed her entire spectacular career to me, and she had sworn a solemn oath that if I ever needed a favor, she would cross the earth to repay her immense debt. The phone rang 3 times before the line clicked open. Valerie snapped her name through the speaker, her voice crisp, sharp, and radiating absolute authority. I took a deep, steadying breath. I dropped the frail, raspy voice of Harry the senile carpenter. I spoke with the deep, resonant, commanding tone of Judge Harry Caldwell. I announced my name, letting the sheer weight of my voice carry across the digital connection. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second. I could hear the chaotic background noise of her bustling Manhattan office instantly vanish as she likely closed her heavy glass door. When she spoke again, the sharp, impatient edge was completely gone, replaced by a tone of profound, deferential respect. She breathed my title, her voice filled with genuine shock and absolute loyalty. She asked what prompted the call and if I was all right, noting my serious tone. I looked around my dusty woodshop, my eyes tracing the sharp edges of my heavy steel saws. I thought about Derek's arrogant smirk. I thought about Melanie's cold, calculating eyes. I thought about the forged medical documents, the illegal antipsychotic poison they were trying to feed me, and the $150 million empire they were actively trying to steal from beneath my feet. My blood ran cold, but my mind was completely on fire. "Valerie," I say, dropping the frail voice, "I need a war room." There was a profound, charged silence on the cellular connection. When Valerie finally spoke, her voice had completely shed the polished corporate veneer of a Manhattan litigator. It was the sharp, fiercely loyal tone of the brilliant young clerk who used to help me dissect complex financial frauds in my judicial chambers. She did not ask if I was absolutely certain. She did not question my mental faculties or suggest that my age was clouding my judgment. She simply asked for my coordinates and the targets. I gave her Derek, complete legal name, his supposed investment firm, the fraudulent doctor they brought into my home, and the specific zoning files I reconstructed from the garage trash. I told her about the hidden water aquifer and the astronomical valuation of my property. I needed the absolute best private investigators her firm had on retainer to dig into every shadow of my son-in-law past. Valerie promised a comprehensive dossier within 48 hours. She instructed me to keep the burner phone powered down and hidden until she initiated contact. I thanked her, terminated the call, and placed the device back into its hidden compartment beneath the floorboard. I walked back into the main house just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the property. I seamlessly slipped right back into my role. For the next 2 days, my performance was a masterpiece of physical and mental decay. I wore mismatched socks, shuffling blindly through the kitchen. I intentionally called Derek by the wrong name, referring to him as David or Daniel, watching his jaw clench with immense irritation. I stared blankly at the floral wallpaper in the hallway for incredible lengths of time, muttering soft, incoherent sentences to people who were not there. They completely lowered their guard. They stopped locking the doors. They stopped hiding their hushed conversations. They viewed me as nothing more than a dying plant in the corner of the room. But while I sat there appearing entirely lost to the world, I was closely observing Derek. I noticed the fine sheen of cold sweat constantly glistening on his forehead. I watched him pace the living room floor late at night, aggressively biting his fingernails. I saw him furiously texting on his phone, his hands shaking with an intense, raw anxiety that had nothing to do with caring for an ailing father-in-law. He was not just a greedy man waiting for a payday. He was a deeply desperate man running out of time. On the third night, shortly after midnight, I was sitting alone in the dark shadows of my woodshop. The burner phone vibrated silently in the palm of my hand. I pressed the green button and raised the device to my ear. Valerie did not bother with pleasantries. Her voice was incredibly tense, carrying a heavy weight of genuine, unfiltered alarm. She told me her elite team of forensic accountants and former federal investigators had spent the last 2 days completely tearing apart Derek's financial history. The intelligence they had uncovered was not just disturbing. It was absolutely terrifying. Derek was not the highly successful, wealthy investment banker he had always claimed to be. His shiny corporate firm was nothing more than a hollow, failing shell holding together a mountain of catastrophic lies. He had spent the last 5 years drowning in a devastating downward spiral of highly leveraged, high-risk investments and illegal underground gambling rings. Valerie laid out the precise, sickening mathematics of his failure. Derek was currently $5 million in debt. He had completely drained his personal savings, liquidated his professional assets, and quietly remortgaged his own properties to the absolute maximum limit. But the most terrifying aspect of the investigation was not the staggering amount of money he owed. It was exactly who he owed it to. Derek had turned to the black market to cover his massive trading losses. He borrowed millions of dollars from a shadowy, unmarked lending firm based entirely offshore. Valerie investigators had traced the complex corporate structure of this lending firm through multiple layers of fake businesses and dummy corporations. The money ultimately led directly back to a highly dangerous, incredibly violent faction of organized crime operating out of the eastern seaboard. These were not the type of men who sent polite collection letters or filed civil lawsuits. These were ruthless, brutal operators who destroyed lives, shattered kneecaps, and vanished people for pennies on the dollar. Derek was a desperate animal trapped in a shrinking cage. The mob had given him a strict, unforgiving deadline to repay his massive $5 million debt, and that deadline was rapidly approaching. Suddenly, the entire horrifying architecture of their grand deception was illuminated with crystal-clear, brutal clarity. Derek did not care about the $150 million valuation of my farm. He could not wait for a legitimate developer to secure building permits, pass environmental reviews, and pay a fair market price over the course of several years. He needed massive amounts of cash immediately to save his own life. Valerie explained the final truly evil phase of his desperate endgame. The mob controlled a front company, a fake commercial real estate firm designed exclusively to launder dirty money through legitimate property acquisitions. Derek's plan was to have me officially declared mentally incompetent by a compromised judge using the fraudulent medical testimony of his paid Manhattan doctor. The exact moment he secured full legal conservatorship over my life and my assets, he was going to sell my pristine 100-acre farm directly to the mob shell company. He was going to sell a property worth $150 million for a fraction of its actual value, perhaps $6 or $7 million. This fraudulent, criminally undervalued sale would accomplish everything he needed. It would immediately wipe his $5 million slate clean with the dangerous men who were threatening his life. It would give the mob a highly valuable piece of Hudson Valley real estate that they could later quietly sell for an astronomical profit, effectively laundering tens of millions of dollars in a single legally binding transaction. And Derek would undoubtedly pocket a handsome $1 million bribe for facilitating the entire operation. It was a perfectly designed, completely ruthless criminal conspiracy. And I was the sacrificial lamb tied firmly to the altar. They were going to chemically destroy my mind with those potent antipsychotic pills, strip away my fundamental human rights, and lock me away in the darkest, most forgotten ward of a state-funded psychiatric facility where no one would ever listen to my complaints. They were going to leave me to rot in an iron cage of manufactured dementia while they sold my life legacy to violent criminals. I stood there in the darkness of my woodshop, gripping the plastic burner phone so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. The cold, analytical mind of a Supreme Court justice fully engaged. I told Valerie to prepare the ultimate legal trap. We were going to war. I explained to Valerie that my former status on the bench and my current predicament required absolute, undeniable proof of premeditated fraud and criminal conspiracy. A sworn affidavit from a private investigator would not be sufficient to satisfy the heavy burden of proof I intended to drop on their heads. I needed them to convict themselves with their own voices, capturing their malicious intent on a digital record that no expensive defense attorney could ever possibly dismiss or manipulate in a court of law. Valerie understood perfectly, recognizing the severe legal stakes involved in this dangerous game. By the following afternoon, she had dispatched a highly trained, discreet courier directly from her prestigious Manhattan firm. The courier did not foolishly drive his vehicle up my long, highly visible gravel driveway. Instead, he parked on the deserted county road and hiked silently through the western tree line, leaving a small, weather-resistant package buried securely beneath a designated pile of gray stones near the very edge of my property line. I waited patiently until dusk, shuffling out of the house under the carefully crafted pretense of wandering aimlessly in the dead winter garden, and retrieved the heavy package. Inside the box were 4 state-of-the-art microcameras, complete with high-definition audio recorders and a secure digital receiver that synced directly to my hidden burner phone. These were not cheap consumer electronics designed for amateur use. They were professional-grade surveillance tools small enough to balance effortlessly on the tip of my index finger, yet powerful enough to transmit encrypted data across a secure cellular network. That night, I waited until the heavy, unbroken silence of the house indicated that Derek and Melanie were deeply asleep in the renovated guest wing. I carefully slipped out of my dark bedroom, moving with silent, calculated precision through the long hallways. I bypassed the squeaking floorboards with the practiced, effortless ease of a man who had built the very foundation beneath my own feet. I went straight to the main kitchen, the central hub of their daily deceptions. I slid underneath the massive granite island, pressing my back flat against the cool, hardwood floor, and held my breath. I carefully mounted the first microcamera in the recessed, heavily shadowed corner directly above the wooden bar stools, angling the tiny microscopic lens to capture the entire open kitchen area. I secured the strong adhesive backing ensuring it was completely invisible unless someone physically crawled under the thick counter to look for it. Next, I moved stealthily into the large living room. I retrieved a small folding step stool from the walk-in pantry, climbed up toward the vaulted ceiling, and unscrewed the metal grating of the central air conditioning vent. I placed the second and third cameras deep inside the dusty ductwork, positioning them carefully to look directly through the narrow metal slats. They provided a flawless, completely unobstructed panoramic view of the expensive leather sofa where Melanie and Derek spent their quiet evenings drinking my vintage wine and planning my ultimate demise. I quickly replaced the metal grating, meticulously wiped away my fingerprints with the edge of my flannel shirt, and returned the step stool to its proper place in the dark pantry. I set up the fourth and final camera in my own private study, aimed directly at the hidden wall safe Derek had violated just a few nights prior. I retreated safely to my woodshop, powered up the hidden digital receiver, and watched the live, high-resolution feeds populate instantly on the glowing screen of my burner phone. The invisible trap was now fully operational. For the next 48 hours, I played the difficult role of the heavily drugged, mentally vacant father with a renewed, terrifying dedication. Knowing that every single interaction, every cruel whisper, and every condescending gesture was now being permanently recorded and transmitted directly to Valerie gave me an immense psychological advantage. I deliberately knocked a heavy crystal glass of ice water onto the kitchen floor, making my hands shake violently, while I issued a continuous stream of pathetic, confused, and trembling apologies. I watched through the hidden, unblinking lenses as Derek smirked wickedly and winked at Melanie across the room. She rolled her eyes in absolute unfiltered disgust, aggressively kicking the sharp glass shards under the oak table and muttering coldly about how she could not wait to be rid of me. I stared blankly at the beige walls, completely unresponsive to their hateful presence, wearing completely mismatched shoes and randomly forgetting Derek's name on multiple occasions. They became entirely convinced that my mind was fundamentally broken, beyond any hope of repair. Their defensive guard dropped entirely, leaving them completely exposed to my silent scrutiny. They stopped closing the heavy wooden doors when they spoke about their dark plans. They felt completely safe and utterly untouchable in their arrogant, malicious deception. The defining explosive moment finally arrived on a rainy Tuesday night. I was lying silently in my bed, staring intently at the glowing screen of my burner phone hidden safely beneath the heavy quilt. The live silent feed from the living room vent showed Derek pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug, a heavy glass of amber liquor clutched tightly in his nervous hand. Melanie was sprawled gracefully on the leather sofa, her bare feet resting casually on the polished mahogany coffee table. The hidden audio feed was crystal clear, capturing the sharp, rhythmic sound of the ice cubes clinking against the glass as Derek moved. He suddenly stopped pacing the floor and turned to face my daughter, his facial expression radiating a sinister, deeply triumphant satisfaction. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his strong drink and smiled a wicked, terrifying smile. "The petition is filed. The judge will look at his medical records, see the dementia, and hand us the keys," Derek announced, his confident voice carrying clearly through the hidden microphone mounted in the ceiling. Melanie did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. She reached quickly for her own crystal glass, a vicious, ugly smile playing on her painted lips. She looked up at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated, absolute greed that completely erased any remaining lingering trace of the sweet little girl I had raised in this very house. "Once he is locked in the state psych ward, I sign the deed over to your guys, and we are on the first flight to Aspen. I cannot wait to never smell his cheap cologne again," she replied, raising her glass in a mocking toast to my permanent destruction. My blood ran completely cold. I lay there motionless, listening to my daughter gleefully celebrating my permanent incarceration. The final fragile thread of my paternal love died in that exact second. There was absolutely no remaining sadness left inside my broken heart, no lingering trace of doubt, and zero room for any future forgiveness. The grieving, foolishly sentimental father evaporated entirely into the freezing night air. He was permanently replaced by the cold, highly calculating, ruthless mind of a judge preparing for an absolute, merciless, and completely destructive war. I finally smiled back. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity of purpose I had not felt since my days presiding over the highest court in the state. The trembling, confused old man they thought they saw shuffling into the kitchen to pour his morning coffee was nothing more than an empty ghost. Beneath that fragile exterior, the judge had fully returned, and he was meticulously preparing his final ruling. I sat at the kitchen island, staring blankly at my bowl of oatmeal, letting a small trail of milk drip down my chin. Derek walked directly past me, casually adjusting his expensive silk tie, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire criminal conspiracy was now sitting securely on an encrypted server in Manhattan. Melanie hummed a cheerful, upbeat tune as she arranged fresh flowers on the counter, acting as if she had not just gleefully toasted to my permanent incarceration the night before. I watched them perform their daily domestic routine, marveling at the sheer, terrifying depth of their sociopathy. They truly believed they had already won. 3 days later, the official court summons arrived, via certified mail. I was sitting in my worn recliner, gazing out the large living room window at the barren winter trees when Melanie approached me. She walked slowly, her footsteps soft and measured, carrying a thick manila envelope in her manicured hands. She knelt beside my chair, adopting a posture of profound, manufactured sorrow. I turned my head slowly, forcing my eyes to look glazed and uncomprehending. Melanie placed her hand gently over mine. I could feel the cold metal of her expensive diamond ring pressing into my skin. She took a deep, shuddering breath, executing a performance that belonged on a theater stage. A single, perfectly timed tear rolled down her powdered cheek. She told me in a voice trembling with fake, practiced emotion that the state was stepping in to help us. She spun a sickening narrative claiming that my memory was slipping too fast, that I was becoming a danger to myself, and that this mandatory court hearing was simply a formality for my own absolute safety. She whispered that she loved me too much to watch me fade away without proper professional intervention. I looked at the thick envelope resting on my lap, bearing the official seal of the state judicial system. I knew exactly what those papers contained. It was a formal petition for total legal conservatorship, accompanied by a heavily falsified medical evaluation signed by their corrupt, highly paid Manhattan physician. It was the legal mechanism designed to strip away my autonomy, my property, and my fundamental human rights. I looked right back into her eyes, seeing the cold, predatory calculation hiding just beneath her fake, glistening tears. I reached up with a violently shaking hand and patted her cheek, offering her a weak, pathetic, and confused smile. I rasped a fragile thank you, telling her that I knew she only wanted what was best for her old father. Melanie let out a soft, relieved sigh, standing up and quickly wiping away her fake tear. She turned her back and walked away, her posture instantly stiffening with arrogant triumph the moment she thought I could no longer see her face. They genuinely believed I would arrive at the courthouse represented by a cheap, overworked public defender, a tired lawyer appointed by the state, who would barely have the time to read my name on the official docket. They fully expected a quick, tragic, and entirely uncontested legal slaughter to happen. They had absolutely no idea about the massive lethal arsenal currently being assembled in the shadows. Later that afternoon, while Derek and Melanie were busy picking out paint colors for the renovations they planned to make once I was locked away, I retreated to the absolute safety of my dusty woodshop. I pulled the hidden burner phone from beneath the heavy floorboard and connected directly with Valerie Shaw. Her massive Manhattan war room was fully operational now. Over the past 72 hours, Valerie had unleashed the full, terrifying power of her elite corporate law firm. We spent 2 solid hours on the secure line, meticulously reviewing every single piece of our impending legal ambush. We were not simply going to contest the fraudulent medical evaluation. We were going to obliterate it completely. Valerie had successfully secured 3 independent, highly respected board-certified neurologists. They had secretly reviewed my actual legitimate medical history, cross-referenced it with the illegal antipsychotic prescriptions Derek had procured, and drafted ironclad sworn affidavits testifying to my perfect, unblemished cognitive health. But the medical defense was only the defensive shield. Our offensive weapons were far more destructive. Valerie had quietly drafted a devastating sequence of emergency subpoenas. She had legally compelled the financial records of the corrupt Manhattan doctor, establishing a clear, undeniable paper trail of massive cash bribes flowing directly from those offshore accounts into that private medical trust. She had subpoenaed the highly classified communications between Derek and the violent men he owed $5 million to exposing the exact horrifying timeline of his desperate real estate laundering scheme. And most importantly, she had legally authenticated the damning audio and video recordings I had captured through the hidden vents. The very words they had spoken in the supposed privacy of my own living room were now officially logged as primary irrefutable evidence of a massive multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy, elder abuse, and attempted medical fraud. The night before the scheduled competency hearing, a heavy, freezing rain began to fall across the dark Hudson Valley. Inside the warm, brightly lit farmhouse, the atmosphere was thick with celebratory anticipation. I sat quietly at the dinner table, pushing a small piece of overcooked fish around my plate, with a trembling fork, maintaining my role until the very last possible second. Derek was in remarkably high spirits, pouring generous glasses of my most expensive vintage champagne. He raised his crystal flute, looking across the polished table at Melanie with a wide, victorious smile. He toasted to new beginnings, to securing their financial future, and to making the difficult but necessary choices for the good of the family. Melanie clinked her glass against his, her eyes sparkling with absolute greed. They drank the expensive champagne, completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. They looked at me with open, unfiltered pity, seeing only a broken, defeated old man who would be locked in a sterile, terrifying psychiatric ward by tomorrow afternoon. They were utterly confident in their flawless, malicious plan to steal my entire estate. I kept my chin resting heavily on my chest, hiding the cold, sharp smile playing at the corners of my mouth. They thought they had cornered a weak, dying animal who could no longer fight back against their wicked schemes. They had absolutely no idea they were casually walking straight into a meticulously designed, inescapable legal slaughterhouse. The trap was perfectly primed, the evidence was completely secure, and the executioner was patiently waiting in the dark shadows. Tomorrow morning I would walk into that familiar courtroom shed, this pathetic disguise, and finally burn their entire corrupt, wicked world to the ground forever. The next morning broke with pale sunlight that did nothing to warm the freezing autumn air. I maintained my carefully constructed facade as we prepared to leave for the county courthouse. Melanie draped a heavy coat over my stooped shoulders, treating me with an exaggerated gentleness. She loudly reminded Derek to grab my thick medical file, her voice laced with a sickly sweet tone of manufactured sorrow. I shuffled obediently toward their luxury sedan. Derek opened the rear door for me, failing to hide his arrogant, victorious smirk. He had absolutely no idea he was chauffeuring his own executioner. The drive into town was filled with their hushed murmurs. They casually discussed the final logistics of the massive real estate transfer, convinced that the man sitting in the back seat could not comprehend a single syllable. I stared blankly out the tinted window, keeping my breathing shallow and my hands trembling. When we arrived at the imposing stone steps of the county courthouse, I allowed Derek to firmly grip my elbow. This building had been my absolute domain for 3 decades. I knew the worn grooves in the marble steps and the distinct scent of floor wax and old paper. To return here in the guise of a broken victim felt like a necessary sacrifice for my trap. We entered the assigned courtroom on the 2nd floor. It was relatively quiet, populated only by a few court clerks and a bored bailiff. Derek directed me to sit at the defense table, pushing me down into the hard wooden chair with careless force. He and Melanie immediately walked over to join their slickly dressed Manhattan attorney at the petitioner table. The lawyer was a young, aggressively confident man who reeked of cheap cologne and unearned arrogance. He was busy organizing his pristine files, chatting amiably with Derek, completely ignoring my presence. I sat completely still, wearing my battered fedora pulled low over my eyes, keeping my chin resting heavily on my chest. A sharp silence fell over the room as the heavy side door swung open. The bailiff loudly announced the arrival of the presiding magistrate. Derek and Melanie stood up promptly. I remained seated for a long moment, forcing Derek to step over and aggressively pull me to my feet. Judge Leonard Brooks walked swiftly up to the elevated bench, his black robes billowing. Leonard was a stern, highly respected jurist with a reputation for absolute fairness. But 30 years ago, he had been a terrified, struggling rookie attorney caught in the crosshairs of a massive career-destroying ethical dilemma. He had been pressured to bury crucial evidence in a high-profile trial I was actively presiding over. Instead of destroying him, I had pulled him into my private chambers, offered him a brutal lesson on legal integrity, and silently guided him toward redemption. I had saved his professional life. Judge Brooks sat down, heavily adjusting his reading glasses as he picked up the official case docket. He cleared his throat, his deep voice echoing through the quiet room as he formally announced the proceedings. He stated that this was an emergency hearing to determine the immediate mental competency and potential legal conservatorship of Harry Caldwell. Derek puffed out his chest, looking immensely proud of his orchestrated legal theater. Melanie dabbed at her dry eyes with a pristine white tissue. Judge Brooks continued reading the preliminary filing, his tone completely detached and professional. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that the Harry Caldwell listed was the very same Chief Justice who had mentored him. He finally lowered the documents and looked across the expansive courtroom. His gaze swept past the slick Manhattan attorney, past Melanie with her fake tears, and past Derek with his smug, victorious grin. His eyes finally landed directly on the frail, stooped figure standing silently behind the heavy wooden defense table. I slowly, deliberately raised my head. I pushed the brim of my battered fedora up just a fraction of an inch, allowing the bright overhead lights to fully illuminate my aged face. I looked directly into his wide eyes, holding his gaze with an intense, unyielding familiarity. I watched the exact second the shocking realization struck him. The healthy color completely drained from Judge Brooks' face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. His jaw slackened slightly, and the heavy wooden gavel actually slipped from his loose grip, clattering loudly against the polished surface of his elevated mahogany desk. He gripped the edges of his tall leather chair, staring at me with a profound mixture of absolute terror, deep confusion, and overwhelming awe. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed entirely trapped in his throat. He knew exactly who I was. He recognized the sharp, calculating intellect hiding just beneath my stooped, pathetic disguise. He realized instantly that this was a highly complex, incredibly dangerous legal battlefield. Before Judge Brooks could recover his professional composure, Derek's slick Manhattan attorney stepped confidently out from behind his table. He completely misread the judge's shock, assuming it was simply professional impatience. The lawyer slapped a thick, heavily bound folder of fraudulent medical files down onto the wooden desk with a loud smack. He puffed out his chest and began his heavily rehearsed, patronizing speech. He claimed in a smooth, oily voice that the man standing before the court was severely mentally incapacitated. He spun a tragic tale of rapid cognitive decline, asserting that I was a fundamental danger to my own physical safety. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger in my direction, declaring the court must immediately grant full conservatorship. Melanie let out a soft, dramatic sob, leaning her head against Derek's shoulder. Derek wrapped a comforting arm around her, wearing a mask of profound sorrow. They were playing their final triumphant scene, completely unaware that the curtain was about to drop permanently on their entire criminal existence. I did not cower. I did not tremble. I stopped the violent shaking in my hands instantly. I planted my heavy leather boots firmly on the solid hardwood floor and stood up completely straight. I pushed my shoulders back, expanding my chest, and instantly stripped away every single trace of the frail, dying old man. The physical transformation was immediate, powerful, and completely jarring. I reached up and pulled the battered fedora from my head, tossing it casually onto the wooden defense table. It landed with a soft, final thud. The slick Manhattan attorney stopped his patronizing speech in mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. Derek abruptly dropped his arm from Melanie's shoulder, his smug smile vanishing into an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. Melanie gasped audibly, taking a fearful, stumbling step backward. I ignored them entirely. I looked the arrogant, terrified lawyer dead in the eye, channeling every ounce of absolute authority I possessed. My voice boomed through the quiet, utterly stunned courtroom, sharp as a razor, and heavy with the promise of absolute impending destruction. I waive my right to a public defender, Your Honor. I am fully competent, and I will represent myself in this fraudulent matter. The heavy silence that followed my declaration was absolute and profound. Judge Leonard Brooks leaned forward over his elevated mahogany desk, his initial shock rapidly transforming into a deep, respectful understanding. He nodded slowly, his eyes locking onto mine with a shared, silent acknowledgement of the brutal battlefield we were about to enter. He struck his wooden gavel once against the sounding block, formally recognizing my legal right to represent myself, completely ignoring the frantic, sputtering objections of Derek, highly paid Manhattan attorney. That arrogant young lawyer was desperately waving his arms, trying to regain control of a narrative that had just been completely shattered. He stammered about procedure and standard protocol, but Judge Brooks silenced him with a single sharp raise of his hand. The judge commanded the attorney to sit down and be quiet, stating clearly that he would hear exactly what I had to say. At that precise moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud echoing crash. Every head in the room turned. Valerie Shaw strode down the center aisle, moving with the terrifying predatory grace of a woman who destroyed corporate empires for a living. She wore a pristine, sharp charcoal suit, her expression carved from absolute ice. Behind her marched a small army of 5 junior paralegals, each one pushing a heavy metal cart loaded high with thick, uniformly labeled banker boxes of evidentiary documents. Valerie did not pause to ask for permission. She walked directly through the swinging wooden gate and took her place standing firmly at my right side. She dropped a massive leather-bound binder onto the defense table with a deafening thud that made Derek physically jump in his seat. Valerie formally introduced herself to the court as my advising legal counsel, officially submitting her credentials and noting that she had brought the requested discovery materials. Derek lawyer looked at Valerie, his face immediately draining of color, as he instantly recognized the most feared corporate litigator in the entire city. He suddenly realized he was a remarkably small fish swimming in an ocean filled with great white sharks. I turned my attention directly to the bench. I thanked Judge Brooks for his time and immediately launched my first devastating strike. I calmly informed the court that the medical folder submitted by the petitioners was a complete malicious fabrication. Valerie handed me a thick stack of pristine certified medical records from 3 independent board-certified neurologists. I submitted them directly into the court record. I clearly detailed how these comprehensive tests conducted mere days ago proved absolutely zero cognitive decline. My brain was functioning perfectly. However, I noted that the comprehensive toxicology panels included in those reports painted a deeply disturbing picture. The blood work proved unequivocally that I was being systematically poisoned. I read the precise chemical compounds aloud, explaining to the court that my system was saturated with potent, unprescribed antipsychotics, the exact same dangerous medication the petitioners had been secretly grinding into my daily meals to artificially simulate severe dementia. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the gallery. Judge Brooks' expression darkened into a mask of pure judicial fury. He demanded to know how I could prove the origin of these toxic chemicals. I did not simply tell him, I showed him. I asked Valerie to play the first digital audio file we had extracted from the hidden living room vents. She pressed a single button on her laptop. The crystal-clear, undeniable sound of Derek's voice filled the stunned courtroom. We all listened in absolute silence as the recorded Derek aggressively negotiated a massive cash bribe with his corrupt Manhattan physician. The recording captured him explicitly, discussing the transfer of $50,000 to a hidden offshore account in exchange for the fabricated dementia diagnosis and a steady illegal supply of the heavy chemical restraints. The audio played his exact words, detailing how they needed to keep me docile and confused, just long enough for the conservatorship to be granted. I turned slowly to look at Derek. He had turned the color of cold ash. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish, completely unable to form a single coherent word of defense. His arrogant posture had entirely collapsed his expensive suit, suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his shrinking, terrified frame. He realized instantly that he was not just losing his grasp on a massive fortune. He was listening to his own guaranteed, unavoidable prison sentence being played aloud in a court of law. But I was not finished. The most agonizing strike was yet to come. I directed my gaze toward Melanie. She was gripping the edge of the wooden table so tightly her knuckles were stark white, her eyes darting frantically around the room looking for any possible avenue of escape. I told the court that the financial greed and the illegal medical tampering were deeply horrific. But the true tragedy of this petition lay in the absolute absence of basic human decency. I asked Valerie to play the second audio file. My daughter's clear, callous voice echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. We heard her cruel laughter. We heard her explicitly stating that once I was safely locked away in a state psychiatric ward, she would sign the deed over to Derek Criminal Associates. We heard her say with chilling, unfiltered excitement that they would be on the first flight to Aspen. We heard her declare that she could not wait to never smell my cheap cologne ever again. The silence that followed her recorded words was heavy, suffocating, and dripping with profound disgust. Even Derek's sleazy lawyer took a physical step away from them, visibly repulsed by the sheer evil radiating from his own clients. I walked slowly out from behind the defense table, stopping only a few feet away from where Melanie sat. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman I had raised, the child I had protected with every ounce of my strength. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, devastating sorrow that cut far deeper than any shout ever could. For 25 years after your mother died, I stepped down from the highest court in this state to build dollhouses for you and keep you safe. And you repaid me with antipsychotics and a straitjacket. The weight of my words slammed into her like a physical blow. The face of my daughter crumpled. She let out a loud, piercing wail that shattered the quiet dignity of the courtroom. She collapsed forward into her chair, burying her face in her hands, and began sobbing hysterically. But looking at her shaking shoulders, I felt no sympathy. I knew those loud, dramatic tears were not born from a realization of guilt or a profound moral awakening. She was not crying for the immense pain she had intentionally inflicted upon her devoted father. She was crying solely for herself. She sobbed from the crushing, terrifying realization that there would be no flights to Aspen, no massive real estate fortunes, and no easy escapes. She realized her life was over. The slaughterhouse doors had closed. The agonizing sound of my daughter crying echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom, but it did not move me. Derek, however, did not collapse into tears. He operated entirely on the instinct of a cornered rat. He looked at his sobbing wife, then looked at the furious face of Judge Brooks, and made a desperate, sickening pivot. He physically stepped away from Melanie, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. His voice, previously dripping with arrogant confidence, now shook with a cowardly, high-pitched whine. He stammered out a rapid stream of chaotic lies, loudly claiming that he had absolutely no idea about the true extent of the medical fraud. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his weeping wife, insisting to the court that he was merely a concerned husband trying his best to help her manage a highly complex and difficult family estate. He swore that the entire operation was Melanie Twisted creation, that she had forced him to coordinate with the corrupt physician and that he was completely innocent of any malicious intent. I stood silently behind the heavy wooden defense table, watching this pathetic creature attempt to throw his own wife under the bus to save his own skin. Melanie stopped crying just long enough to stare up at him in sheer unadulterated shock, her tear-streaked face registering the ultimate betrayal. I did not raise my voice to argue with his cowardly claims. I simply looked at him, letting a cold, ruthless, and entirely merciless smile spread slowly across my face. I turned to my right, extending an open hand toward Valerie Shaw. She did not hesitate. She reached into the heavy banker box resting on our table and withdrew a thick, securely bound stack of financial dossiers. The papers were stamped with the official seals of federal investigators and international banking regulators. I took the heavy stack of documents and walked slowly, deliberately across the polished hardwood floor, stopping directly in front of the petitioner's table. Derek stopped his frantic rambling the exact second he saw the thick files in my hands. I placed the documents down onto the polished wood, spreading them out, so he could clearly see the highlighted account numbers and the damning transaction records. I spoke with the calm, methodical rhythm of a judge delivering a final, inescapable verdict. I informed the court and Derek that we had successfully traced every single desperate financial maneuver he had executed over the past 5 years. I detailed his completely bankrupt investment firm, his disastrous trading losses, and his illegal offshore gambling habits. I watched his face turn a sickly shade of gray as I systematically dismantled the wealthy, successful facade he had built his entire identity around. I raised my voice just enough to ensure every single person in the courtroom could hear the absolute truth of his pathetic existence. I explained to Judge Brooks that the man standing before him was not a concerned family member trying to protect an ailing father-in-law. He was a desperate, failing criminal who currently owed $5 million to a highly violent syndicate of organized crime. I laid out the precise mechanics of his intended real estate scheme. I explained how he planned to use the fraudulent conservatorship to sell my pristine $150 million farm to a mob-controlled shell company for a fraction of its true market value. I detailed how this illegal transaction would wipe his slate clean with the violent men who were threatening his life while simultaneously allowing him to pocket a massive illegal bribe for facilitating the money laundering operation. Derek stood frozen, his eyes wide and completely glazed over with absolute panic. He was physically shaking, his breath coming in short. Rapid gasps as the total weight of his exposed criminal conspiracy crashed down upon his shoulders. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat against the wooden table, bringing my face just a few inches away from his sweating, terrified features. I lowered my voice into a sharp, icy whisper that was meant entirely for him, though the courtroom was so dead silent that the words carried easily to the bench. By the way, Derek, the court isn't the only one who got these files. Valerie sent a copy to your creditors this morning. They now know you were planning to skim millions off the top of their real estate deal. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. Derek did not argue. He did not attempt another lie. The last remaining shred of color completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin looking like translucent parchment. His eyes darted wildly toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, as if he expected a team of ruthless killers to burst through at any given second. The pure, unadulterated terror radiating from his body was a physical, tangible force. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the hard wooden floor, falling completely to his knees. He raised his shaking hands, grasping blindly at the edge of the table, letting out a low, guttural moan of absolute despair. He knew that prison was no longer his biggest problem. He had actively tried to cheat some of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard, and now they held the undeniable proof of his betrayal. Judge Leonard Brooks watched the pathetic scene unfold with an expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp, deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. His voice boomed with absolute, unyielding judicial authority. He declared that the petition for conservatorship was officially and permanently dismissed with extreme prejudice. He formally ordered the immediate preservation of all financial and medical evidence presented by the defense. He then looked directly at the two armed court bailiffs standing alert near the rear exits. He pointed a steady, unwavering finger at the trembling man kneeling on the floor and the sobbing woman sitting frozen in her chair. He loudly commanded the officers to immediately arrest Derek and Melanie for grand financial fraud, attempted medical tampering, and severe elder abuse. The bailiffs moved swiftly across the room, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. They pulled Derek roughly to his feet, ignoring his incoherent, terrified babbling, and snapped cold steel handcuffs securely around his wrists. Melanie did not fight back as they pulled her arms behind her back. She simply hung her head completely broken, stepping forward into the custody of the state. I stood tall and completely silent, watching the two greedy predators being marched out of the courtroom in absolute humiliating disgrace. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind them, leaving a profound, cleansing silence in their wake. I slowly turned around to face Valerie Shaw, who offered me a firm, deeply respectful nod of professional solidarity. My home, my mind, and my priceless legacy were finally and permanently secure. The agonizing war was officially over, and the righteous judge had delivered his ultimate ruling. I was finally free. This dark nightmare was over. Justice prevailed, always. The heavy air in the courtroom began to circulate again as the chaotic energy of the hearing finally dissipated into the polished wooden walls. Justice prevailed. Always. The sharp, unmistakable sound of cold steel ratcheting tight echoed sharply across the quiet room. Click, click. The metallic snaps locked firmly onto Derek's wrists, binding his hands securely behind his back. The two broad-shouldered court bailiffs hauled him upward, their grips merciless and perfectly professional. Derek did not resist their pull. He did not utter a single word of protest or proclaim his innocence anymore. The man who had strutted into this municipal building, reeking of arrogant confidence and cheap designer cologne, had been entirely erased from existence. In his place stood a hollow, trembling shell of a human being. His expensive Italian leather shoes dragged uselessly against the marble floor as the officers moved him toward the side exit. He looked exactly like a dead man walking. The crushing reality of his situation had entirely short-circuited his nervous system. He knew with absolute certainty that federal prison was going to be the absolute safest place for him to hide. The mob creditors he had foolishly attempted to swindle were already looking for him, and their reach extended far beyond the iron bars of a state penitentiary. I watched his retreating back with clinical detachment, feeling absolutely no pity for the architect of my intended demise. The heavy side doors opened and swallowed Derek whole, leaving the courtroom eerily vacant, save for a few lingering clerks packing away their legal transcripts. Valerie Shaw stood quietly near the plaintiff table, silently organizing her pristine evidentiary files, allowing me the necessary space to conclude my personal affairs. And then there was Melanie. She had been left temporarily unsupervised near the center aisle, abandoned by the coward she had conspired with. The sudden, profound silence of the room seemed to shatter her final fragile layer of delusion. She looked around the empty space, her wide, wet eyes darting frantically from the empty judge bench to the heavy oak exit doors, finally landing directly on my face. The absolute finality of her total destruction washed over her. She did not stand up with the proud, haughty posture she had modeled for the past 6 months in my home. Instead, she fell completely to her knees. The expensive fabric of her designer skirt scraped roughly against the hardwood floor as she began to physically crawl across the distance separating us. It was a pathetic, deeply humiliating display of manufactured desperation. Her manicured hands reached out, trembling violently, as she closed the final few feet between us. She lunged forward, her fingers hooking desperately into the soft fabric of my worn flannel shirt. She gripped the hem so tightly, her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white, anchoring herself to the very man she had gleefully planned to lock away in a sterile psychiatric ward. The sobbing began again, a harsh guttural sound that tore through her throat. She tilted her face upward, her carefully applied makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. She begged for my forgiveness, her voice a shrill, piercing shriek that bounced off the high ceiling. She screamed that she was incredibly sorry, that she had made a terrible mistake, and that she never truly wanted any of this to happen. The lies spilled from her lips like toxic water. She frantically attempted to rewrite the undeniable history we had all just witnessed. She wailed that Derek was a monster who had completely brainwashed her, manipulating her fragile mind into participating in his wicked, greedy schemes. She claimed she was just a frightened victim of his controlling nature, terrified of what he might do if she refused to play along with his horrific real estate laundering operation. I stood perfectly still, allowing the heavy weight of her desperate performance to wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. I looked down at the weeping woman, clutching the bottom of my shirt. 30 years of profound, unconditional paternal love had once lived inside my chest for her. I had protected her, provided for her, and sacrificed my own peace to ensure her absolute safety and happiness. But looking at her now, listening to her pathetic attempts to deflect the blame for a conspiracy she had actively celebrated, I felt nothing. There was no lingering anger. There was no residual sadness. There was only absolute freezing, zero emotion. The father she had known was permanently dead, murdered by her own treacherous greed. Only the Chief Justice remained, and he was completely immune to the fake tears of a convicted felon. I did not yell. I did not scold her or offer a grand emotional lecture about the sacred bonds of family trust. I simply looked down at her grasping, frantic hands. I slowly reached down with my own weathered hands. My movements were calm, deliberate, and entirely steady. I placed my fingers gently over hers. I did not pry them away with violent force or aggressive anger. I simply applied a firm, steady, and unrelenting pressure. One by one, I gently peeled her tightly curled fingers off the fabric of my flannel shirt. She resisted slightly at first, letting out a small, wounded gasp as she felt her physical connection to me being severed, but she was completely powerless against the absolute finality of my grip. I detached her hands from my clothing and let them fall uselessly back to her sides. I stepped back, creating a clear, unbridgeable physical boundary between us. She slumped forward, her hands resting flat against the cold floorboards, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She finally understood that her manipulative performance was completely ineffective. The cold, unyielding reality of her future was staring her directly in the face, and there was absolutely no escape from the legal and financial destruction she had brought upon herself. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, ensuring she would carry my final words with her for the rest of her miserable existence. My voice was quiet, even and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, cutting cleanly through her hysterical sobbing. "The $150 million, I stated clearly, letting the massive numerical figure hang heavy in the quiet air, will go entirely to a private foundation explicitly dedicated to protecting the vulnerable victims of severe elder abuse." I paused, allowing the absolute devastation of that truth to fully register in her mind. The vast fortune she had meticulously plotted to steal, the wealth she had traded her own soul to acquire, was now permanently legally locked away, weaponized, to destroy predators exactly like her. I looked at her ruined face one last time. "You chose blind, malicious greed over your own devoted father. Now you get to live the rest of your life with absolutely neither." Melanie let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her shoulders collapsed inward, and she crumpled completely against the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into the vast emptiness. I turned and walked out the heavy oak doors without looking back, stepping forward to embrace a very quiet and truly peaceful world. 3 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the county courthouse closed behind me. I am standing on the sprawling wooden porch of my farmhouse, holding a warm porcelain cup of black coffee in my weathered hands. The morning air of the Hudson Valley is incredibly crisp and clean, carrying the sharp, invigorating scent of pine needles and damp earth. A gentle breeze sweeps across the vast expanse of the property, rustling the bare branches of the ancient oak trees that line the long gravel driveway. The oppressive, suffocating toxicity that once permeated every single corner of this property has been completely eradicated. The dark shadows of deception, the quiet whispers of malice, and the constant draining performance of a broken mind are gone. I take a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing morning air fill my lungs, and for the first time in what feels like a lifetime, I feel an absolute, unshakable sense of peace. I am no longer a victim. The silence that surrounds me now is not the terrifying, isolated quiet of a man waiting to be discarded. It is the majestic, triumphant silence of a hard-fought victory. The farmhouse, which had briefly been transformed into a hostile territory by the very people I trusted most, has been fully reclaimed. It is once again a sanctuary. I walk slowly across the wooden floorboards, listening to the familiar, comforting creak beneath my leather boots. I look out over the rolling hills of the estate, watching the pale golden sunlight break through the thick gray winter clouds. This magnificent land, this sanctuary that I built with my own two hands, and the sweat of my brow remains entirely mine. They tried to steal it. They tried to launder it away into the hands of violent criminals, but they failed. Their greed was their ultimate undoing, and the trap they walked into was completely inescapable. Derek is currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The financial dossiers Valerie Shaw provided to the court and to his dangerous creditors triggered a massive multi-agency federal investigation. His entire sleazy corporate empire crumbled overnight. The mob affiliates he tried to swindle did not take kindly to his intended betrayal, and the federal government offered him a heavily guarded cell in exchange for a complete confession. He will spend the next 2 decades surrounded by cold concrete and steel bars, completely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his arrogant smirk. He is a ruined, defeated man, completely erased from the privileged society he fought so dirty to climb into. I feel absolutely no pity for him. He was a parasite, and the system dealt with him exactly as the law dictates. Melanie, on the other hand, faces a completely different kind of prison. The state prosecutors aggressively pursued the elder abuse and medical fraud charges. She avoided a lengthy prison sentence by accepting a devastating plea deal, one that stripped her of her professional licenses, drained her personal bank accounts, and mandated hundreds of grueling community service hours. But her true punishment is the absolute isolation she now lives in. She lost her husband, she lost her wealthy lifestyle, and she permanently lost the father who had unconditionally loved her. She has reached out a dozen times, sending pathetic, tear-stained letters, begging for a second chance, pleading for financial assistance, asking for the door to be opened just a crack. Every single letter has been returned to sender unopened and unread. I spent a long time grieving the daughter I thought I had, but I eventually realized that the sweet, innocent girl I raised had died many years ago. The woman who took her place was a stranger, a callous predator who viewed my life as nothing more than a convenient stepping stone to an early inheritance. Cutting her out of my life was not an act of cruelty. It was a necessary amputation to save my own soul. In the wake of that profound betrayal, I experienced a powerful, unexpected rebirth. The frail, trembling old man who spilled water on the kitchen floor and forgot his own name evaporated completely, replaced by the sharp, authoritative mind of the Chief Justice. I spent the last 90 days working tirelessly alongside Valerie Shaw and her elite team of corporate litigators. We were not merely tying up the loose ends of my estate. We were actively building a fortress. This morning, right before I walked out onto this porch, I sat at my heavy mahogany desk and signed the final irrevocable legal documents. The paperwork is completely finalized. I have officially established the Catherine Foundation, proudly named in honor of my late beloved wife. It is a tribute to her boundless compassion and her fierce protective spirit. The vast profits generated by this $150 million estate will no longer sit idle in bank accounts. and they will certainly never fall into the hands of greedy, entitled heirs. Instead, the entire financial yield of this land has been legally dedicated to funding the foundation. The primary mission of the Catherine Foundation is to provide elite, relentless, and completely free legal defense for vulnerable senior citizens who find themselves targeted by predatory relatives. We will hire the most aggressive litigators in the country to step into the courtroom and fight for the men and women who cannot fight for themselves. We will dismantle fraudulent conservatorships, expose corrupt medical professionals, and ensure that no elderly person is ever stripped of their dignity, their property, or their basic human rights simply because their own family decided they were no longer useful. Looking out at the horizon, I feel the comforting presence of Catherine standing right beside me. I know she would be incredibly proud of the battle I fought and the permanent legacy we have now established. The nightmare I endured has been meticulously transformed into a powerful weapon for justice. I take one final sip of my dark coffee, feeling the warm liquid combat the freezing morning chill and giving me a renewed strength. I turn away from the vast landscape and walk steadily back inside my beautiful, quiet home, ready to begin the vital work that lies ahead. The war may be over, but the mission has only just begun. The hardest lesson I learned is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and a shared last name does not prevent betrayal. We often blind ourselves to the red flags of the people we love, making excuses for their cruelty, because we are desperate to keep the family intact. But true evil doesn't always break down your front door. Sometimes it sits at your dinner table offering you a glass of water. Never ignore your instincts. Setting boundaries and enforcing brutal consequences against toxic family members isn't a lack of love. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. If this story opened your eyes to the harsh realities of family betrayal, please hit that like button to support justice. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more raw, unfiltered life stories. Share exactly what you would do if your own child plotted against you down in the comments.